My name is Natalie, and the night I turned 18 was the night my mom canceled my birthday because my little sister had a tantrum. I had spent weeks telling myself this day mattered not because of a party or presents, but because it was supposed to be the moment my life officially became mine. Instead, that morning slid into afternoon, and everything quietly shifted away from me. My sister lost control over something unrelated, emotions spilling everywhere, and the house instantly rearranged itself around her mood. My mom didn't ask what I wanted or even tell me what she was doing until it was already done. She said it was better to keep things calm, that this wasn't the right time, that family peace came first. Then my sister said something that still rings in my head, not shouted, not dramatic, just flat and certain, the kind of sentence that doesn't need to be repeated to be understood. If she wasn't going to have a good day, neither was I. No one corrected her. No one looked at me to see if I was okay with that. I stood there realizing my birthday had been erased without a single conversation, like it had never belonged to me in the first place. I didn't argue or cry or try to convince anyone that this mattered. I went upstairs, closed my door, and started packing slowly, carefully, because something in me already knew this wasn't just about a canceled celebration. It was about how easily my place could be replaced by someone else's feelings. That was the moment I understood my role in this family had been decided long before I turned 18. Before you assume I overreacted or that this was just about a party, stay with me and subscribe to hear the full story, because what happened after I walked away didn't blow up overnight. It unraveled quietly, and the life they worked so hard to keep perfect didn't fall apart because I caused chaos. It fell apart because I stopped holding everything together for them. Later that day, the tension in the house didn't come from anything I did. It came from something that had gone wrong for my sister. A separate issue that spiraled fast, the kind of situation where her emotions filled every room and pushed everything else out. It started with frustration, then tears, then raised voices, and before long, the entire atmosphere shifted around her mood. I had seen this pattern too many times to misunderstand it. When she unraveled, the priority was never fixing the situation itself. It was calming her down at any cost. My mom reacted on instinct, moving quickly, lowering her voice, reassuring her that everything would be handled, that nothing else mattered in that moment. Without saying it out loud, she began reorganizing the day around one goal: keeping my sister stable. At that point, I still believed my birthday plans existed somewhere in the background, waiting until things settled down, but I didn't know that my mom had already decided they were expendable. She didn't ask me what I wanted. She didn't come upstairs to explain or even warn me. She picked up her phone and started reaching out to people as if she were doing me a favor. Instead of telling the truth, she chose the easiest version of the story, one that avoided questions, and removed my sister from the situation entirely. She told people I wasn't feeling well, that it would be better to cancel, that everyone would understand. In her mind, it was a clean solution. She spoke for me, answered for me, and closed the situation before I even knew it was happening. While I was still assuming the day might be salvaged, the messages were already being sent one after another, locking in a decision I had never agreed to. I realized something was wrong when my phone stayed quiet longer than it should have. No one checked in. No one asked what time they should come by. When I finally asked my mom what was going on, she looked at me with surprise, like I was behind on a conversation we were supposed to be having together. She told me she had taken care of it, that everything was canceled, and that this was the best way to keep things from getting worse. There was no apology in her voice, only certainty, as if she had done the responsible thing. By the time she explained it to me, there was nothing left to decide. The explanation came afterward, wrapped in practicality and concern, but the choice itself was already over. My dad was there too, listening, and he knew exactly what had happened. I could tell by the way he avoided my eyes and kept repeating that everyone needed to calm down. He didn't question her decision or suggest that maybe I should have been included. He stood there quietly and let the moment pass. His silence didn't feel neutral. It felt like permission. It told me that in situations like this, my mom's instincts ruled, and my role was to accept whatever came next without making things harder. As the reality settled in, what I felt wasn't just disappointment, it was the sharp realization that my voice hadn't even been necessary. No one had paused to see if this mattered to me. No one had weighed my feelings against my sister's. The entire narrative had been written without my input, and I had been reduced to a problem that needed to be managed. Standing there listening to my mom explain why it was easier this way and watching my dad nod along, I finally saw the pattern clearly. When things became uncomfortable, my needs were the first thing to be adjusted, delayed, or erased. What stayed with me wasn't the excuse she gave or the reason she chose. It was how natural it all felt to them. This wasn't a dramatic mistake or a rushed decision. It was familiar, practiced, something they had done before in smaller ways. In that moment, I understood that my birthday hadn't been canceled because there was no other option. It had been canceled because I was the easiest person to disappoint, and as I stood there absorbing how quickly my choice had been taken from me, I realized it wasn't just the celebration that was gone, it was the understanding that my say in my own life could be overridden whenever it became inconvenient. After everything was already decided, I went back into the kitchen and asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the moment I found out why my birthday had been canceled without anyone bothering to tell me first. Elaine answered immediately, like she had been waiting for it, saying, "This wasn't about me personally. It was about the family, and about keeping things from getting worse." She said Paige was overwhelmed, that she wasn't stable enough to handle extra pressure, and that sometimes situations required sacrifices to protect everyone involved. Michael stood nearby, arms crossed, staring at the counter instead of at me, repeating that this didn't need to turn into an argument and that everyone just needed to calm down. He wasn't choosing sides, he was choosing silence, the kind that lets decisions stand without ever having to defend them. Paige leaned back in her chair and said I was blowing things out of proportion, that it was just a birthday, that I knew how hard things had been for her lately. When I didn't respond right away, she accused me of lacking empathy, of only thinking about myself instead of understanding what the family was dealing with. Elaine stepped in again, reinforcing it, explaining that Paige was younger, more sensitive, and needed extra support right now, while I had always been more independent. Then she said it in a tone that sounded reasonable enough to end the conversation, that being the older one meant I could handle disappointment better, that I was strong, and that strength came with responsibility. She framed it like a compliment, like proof that she trusted me more. But what it really meant was that my needs were negotiable in a way Paige's never were. I looked at Michael, waiting for him to interrupt, to say that this wasn't fair, that turning 18 mattered, but he stayed quiet, his jaw tight, like acknowledging it would only make things messier. Paige watched my face closely, and when I didn't raise my voice or argue back, she took it as confirmation that she was right, that this was settled. I felt something go still inside me. I didn't list the times I had adjusted my plans or the moments I had stepped back, so things could stay smooth. I didn't explain how hearing my birthday dismissed as a problem to be managed felt. I just listened as Elaine continued, saying no one was trying to hurt me, that this was about timing and priorities, that we all had to do our part to keep the family functioning. The word family kept coming up, even though it was being used to justify why only one person was expected to bend. Paige added that I always landed on my feet anyway, that I was fine, that this wasn't going to ruin my life. Michael finally spoke again softly, saying he just wanted peace in the house. Like peace was something that could exist without fairness, like it was reasonable to ask one person to absorb all the discomfort so everyone else could feel okay. I nodded, not in agreement, but because I could feel how solid their reasoning was to them, how complete the circle had already closed. Pushing back wouldn't change the decision, it would only make me the problem. What struck me wasn't the logic itself, But how familiar it felt, how easily responsibility slid onto me without anyone acknowledging it as a choice. Standing there, surrounded by explanations that sounded thoughtful and caring on the surface, I realized how often being called strong had really meant being expected to accept less. There was a moment where I could have argued, where I could have demanded that my birthday mattered too, but instead, I noticed how my silence settled the room, how quickly everyone relaxed once I stopped resisting. In that quiet, something became painfully clear. Being asked to give in was never temporary. It didn't come with an endpoint, and it didn't stop just because I was an adult. The expectation to step aside didn't have limits, it only had direction. The front door opened not long after the conversation lost momentum, and Laura Bennett walked in with the kind of calm that made the tension in the house feel suddenly visible. She didn't announce herself or rush to fill the silence, she just paused, looking around as if she were taking inventory of what didn't make sense. Elaine greeted her too quickly, explaining before Laura had asked anything that plans had changed, and everyone was just dealing with a stressful day. Laura listened without reacting, setting her bag down and letting the explanation finish on its own. When she finally spoke, she didn't ask what happened. She asked how the decision had been made so fast. Elaine repeated the same reasoning she had used earlier, talking about balance, about protecting the family from things escalating, about making choices in the moment. Michael stepped in to support it, saying, parenting meant acting decisively sometimes, and that not every decision could be discussed at length. Laura nodded, but her attention shifted subtly, not to the words being spoken, but to who was doing the speaking. She watched how Elaine answered questions directed at me, how Michael avoided eye contact when the conversation edged toward responsibility, how Paige sat rigid, already bracing for blame. Laura turned to me, then, not with sympathy, but with curiosity, and asked whether anyone had actually checked with me before canceling. Elaine answered immediately, saying there hadn't been time, and that everything moved quickly. Laura didn't challenge that directly, but she paused long enough that the answer felt thin. She mentioned remembering other moments over the years when similar calls had been made in the name of keeping things calm. Situations that seemed minor at the time, but followed the same logic. Elaine dismissed it as overthinking, saying every family had its patterns and outsiders didn't always understand the full context. Laura accepted that on the surface, then gently pointed out that patterns usually became visible precisely because they repeated. Michael shifted his weight and cleared his throat, trying to redirect the conversation towards something lighter, but Laura stayed focused, asking how often decisions landed on the same person without being discussed. Paige jumped in defensively, saying no one was forcing anything, that she hadn't asked for plans to be canceled, that she was tired of being treated like the problem. Laura looked at her steadily and said she wasn't assigning blame. She was observing how outcomes consistently worked in one direction. The distinction unsettled the room. Elaine tightened her grip on the narrative, emphasizing that everything they did was out of care, that love sometimes meant sacrifice, that everyone contributed in different ways. Laura acknowledged that, then noted that sacrifice usually involved a choice, not a decision made on someone's behalf. The silence that followed wasn't hostile, it was uncomfortable, the kind that forms when explanations stop lining up cleanly. Laura mentioned Eric Hughes, casually saying she had spoken to him earlier, and he had assumed things were still happening because that was what he'd been told. Elaine hesitated before responding, adjusting her explanation to account for it. Her voice sharper now. Michael stared at the floor. The realization that someone outside the house had expected a different version of events made the situation feel exposed. Laura didn't accuse anyone of lying, she simply remarked that the story seemed to change depending on who was listening. Paige crossed her arms again, muttering that this was being blown out of proportion. Elaine insisted there was no deception, only last-minute adjustments. Laura accepted the clarification without arguing, but her posture shifted, less relaxed, more attentive, like someone who had noticed a flaw they couldn't ignore. She didn't take sides or offer solutions, she just stayed present, and that alone altered the dynamic. Conversations that had felt settled now felt provisional. Justifications that had sounded reasonable moments earlier began to sound rehearsed. I stayed quiet, watching how carefully everyone chose their words, now that there was someone in the room who wasn't invested in maintaining the same version of reality. When Laura finally said she was going to step outside for a moment, the air in the house seemed to rush back all at once. No one followed her. No one spoke. The silence felt different this time, heavier, because it wasn't built on agreement, it was built on awareness. Nothing dramatic had been said, no accusations had been made, but something essential had shifted. For the first time, the family's version of itself had been seen from the outside, and the imbalance we had all learned to normalize was no longer invisible. After Laura stepped outside, the house didn't erupt or calm down. It settled into a strained quiet that felt deliberate, like everyone was choosing not to acknowledge what had just been exposed. I didn't announce my decision or explain it to anyone. I simply went upstairs and started packing with a steady focus that surprised even me. I chose clothes, personal things, documents, items that were mine, and I left behind everything that felt tied to obligation. There was no rush, no shaking hands, no dramatic pause, because I didn't want this to look like an emotional outburst that could be dismissed later. Downstairs, low voices started again, the familiar sound of my parents smoothing things over, convincing themselves this would pass if they treated it like any other conflict. Halfway through packing, Elaine called up the stairs and asked if I could take care of something I had always handled for the family, a small task that usually landed on me without discussion. I stopped, considered it for a moment, and said no. I didn't raise my voice or offer an explanation, I just said I wasn't going to do it. The reaction came fast and said more than any argument could. Elaine brushed it off as me being upset and said we would talk later once I calmed down. Michael added that I shouldn't make decisions while emotional and that everyone needed time to cool off. To them, my refusal wasn't a boundary, it was a phase. Paige laughed quietly and said I was being dramatic, that I'd come back once I realized this wasn't worth the trouble. No one asked where I was going or whether I had somewhere to stay. They assumed I wasn't really leaving, just stepping away long enough to reset. When I carried my bags downstairs, Elaine followed me toward the door, her tone softer now, saying, I didn't need to do this, that walking out over one bad day was extreme. Michael stood back watching, saying nothing that would slow me down or stop me trusting that neutrality would eventually bring things back to normal. Paige stayed where she was, scrolling on her phone, already disengaged, as if my absence was something she could ignore until it inconvenienced her. Elaine reminded me that this was my home and that I could come back whenever I wanted. Like that alone should have been enough to make me stay. I didn't argue with her, I stepped outside instead. The air felt heavier but clearer, like I could finally stand without adjusting myself to fit the space around me. I didn't look back because I didn't need to see their reactions to know what they were thinking. They believed I would return once the tension faded. That belief followed me over the next few days. My phone buzzed with messages that sounded more irritated than concerned. Elaine asked where I was and said we would talk tomorrow. Michael sent a short message telling me to stay safe and not make things harder than they needed to be. Paige didn't reach out at all. As time passed, the messages shifted slightly but never in substance. They asked when I was coming home, when I would stop overreacting, when things would go back to normal. No one asked why I left or what I needed in order to come back. Each response I gave became shorter than the last, until I stopped responding altogether. I didn't announce that I needed space, I simply took it. I muted the group chat. I let calls go to voicemail. I didn't block anyone, but I stopped making myself available to manage their discomfort. What struck me during that time wasn't the absence of my family, it was how easily they adapted to me not being there. Elaine assumed I was cooling off and would eventually return to my role. Michael believed distance would smooth things over without requiring any real change. Paige treated my absence like a minor disruption, something that would resolve itself once I stopped making it an issue. None of them chased after me. None of them showed up to ask what had broken. They underestimated what they had lost because they had never fully acknowledged what I had been carrying. For years, I had absorbed tension-adjusted plans and filled gaps quietly so things could keep moving. Without me, the structure they relied on began to hollow out, but at that point, they still didn't see it. To them, the space I left behind wasn't a warning, it was empty time that would eventually fill itself again, and that assumption, the belief that I would always come back and resume my place without question, was the moment they misjudged the situation completely, because this time leaving wasn't a pause, it was a line being drawn. Life did not collapse the moment I left it, rearranged itself in a way no one was prepared for, and the absence I left behind was quiet enough at first that it was easy to ignore. The house still followed routines, meals still happened, bills were still paid, but the small adjustments I used to make without being asked stopped happening, and no one noticed until those gaps started causing friction. Elaine assumed things would smooth out on their own, the way they always had, not realizing they never smoothed themselves. Michael stayed focused on work and structure, believing time would absorb the tension, while time only made it sharper. Paige felt the shift almost immediately, not as loss, but as resistance, because when she raised her voice, people no longer softened theirs in response. The first real sign came when she snapped at a neighbor over a shared driveway, expecting the usual understanding, and instead received a formal complaint, polite but firm, something that had never happened before. At school, she pushed back on a deadline the same way she always had, assuming flexibility would follow, and was told the rules applied to her like everyone else, which left her furious and confused, convinced the world had suddenly turned against her, without seeing that the buffer she relied on was gone. Inside the house, everyday logistics became sources of irritation. Appointments were missed because no one double-checked them. Groceries ran out because assumptions replaced coordination, and Elaine started talking about exhaustion and carrying everything alone without ever acknowledging she had never been carrying it alone in the first place. Michael tried to stay neutral, telling everyone to calm down, but neutrality stopped working when problems required decisions instead of silence. Paige grew louder and more defensive, treating pushback as betrayal rather than consequence. No one said my name out loud, but my absence sat in the middle of every unresolved issue, an unspoken variable shaping every argument. The shift did not stay contained inside the house. The neighborhood noticed the raised voices that carried further than before, the canceled plans that stopped being occasional and became routine. Elaine stopped getting casual invitations and started receiving careful check-ins. Michael overheard comments at work framed as concern, but edged with curiosity about whether everything was okay at home. The Foster family had always been seen as steady and organized, the kind of household people trusted without thinking about it, and that image began to crack, not because of one incident, but because consistency had been replaced with visible strain. Eric Hughes became part of the fallout without trying to be, because he had expected a celebration and mentioned it to others, and when nothing happened, the questions followed him back to the house. When he stopped by to return something Paige had borrowed, he walked into a tense exchange that ended abruptly when he entered the room, and although he did not accuse or confront anyone, he noticed how explanations shifted, how Elaine filled the silence too quickly, and Michael avoided eye contact. Eric mentioned that people were asking if everything was fine, not out of gossip but confusion, and Elaine brushed it off as a phase, even as the explanation sounded thinner each time she repeated it. Michael listened more closely than he admitted, his silence heavier now, less passive, while Paige reacted with irritation, snapping that people should mind their own business, unaware that the way she was being received had changed because the system protecting her had changed. Without me, there was no one quietly recalibrating situations before they escalated. No one translating tension into something manageable, and the family kept treating each problem as separate instead of connected to the same missing piece. Elaine tried to control outcomes more tightly and created more resistance. Michael lowered expectations instead of addressing imbalance. Paige pushed harder, believing force would restore the comfort she had lost. None of it worked. The cost of that birthday did not show up as guilt or regret. It showed up as friction, as social consequences, as the slow erosion of the image they had relied on for years, and by the time it became clear the damage was not temporary, it was already embedded, practical, public, and impossible to ignore. The silence lasted longer than I expected, long enough that I almost believed they had finally learned how to live without me, until one afternoon my phone lit up with a number I hadn't saved but could recognize instantly. I let it ring out then again, and when the voicemail came through, it confirmed exactly what I already knew. Elaine's voice was controlled and careful, not apologetic, just strained in that familiar way she used whenever something in the house stopped working smoothly. She talked about how things had been difficult lately, how everyone was overwhelmed, how the family felt unbalanced. And then she said, my name, the way she always did when she needed something fixed. I waited a few days before calling back, not out of spite, but to make sure I wasn't reacting emotionally, and when I finally did, the pattern revealed itself almost immediately. There was no acknowledgement of my birthday, no mention of what had led me to leave, just concern framed as logistics. Elaine explained that Paige was struggling more than expected, that her behavior was causing problems, that Michael was exhausted, that everything felt heavier without me around. Michael took the phone next, his tone softer, but his meaning unchanged, saying it wasn't about blame or revisiting the past, that families adapt, that maybe I could help smooth things over by being more involved again. Paige never spoke directly, but I could hear her in the background, impatient and irritated, that the call wasn't moving faster, already assuming the outcome. Listening to them, it became clear that nothing fundamental had changed. My absence only mattered because it had created inconvenience, not because it had been caused by harm. No one asked how I was doing or what my life looked like. Now they assumed I was waiting to step back into the role that made theirs easier. I didn't argue or raise my voice, because that had never altered the result before. I said I wasn't coming back, and I wasn't stepping in, not temporarily, not to help manage Paige, not to stabilize the house, not in any version of the role I had already outgrown. Elaine reacted immediately, saying, families don't give up on each other, that I was being extreme, that Paige was younger, and needed understanding, that I had always been strong enough to handle distance if it meant helping everyone else. Michael tried to negotiate, suggesting compromises that all led to the same place: phone calls, visits, involvement without calling it responsibility, as if changing the language would change the weight of it. I listened and noticed once again that every solution required adjustment from me and none from them. When there was a pause, I said no, again calmly, without listing reasons or reopening old arguments. I told them I wasn't responsible for fixing a system they refused to examine, and that my life no longer had space for a role built on endurance instead of choice. Elaine accused me of being cold and selfish, of punishing the family when things were already hard, of walking away instead of being grateful. Michael went quiet, the same silence he had used for years when conflict demanded action. Paige laughed in the background, dismissive, and certain I would regret this, convinced it was another phase I would eventually outgrow. I ended the call before it could turn louder, not because I was overwhelmed, but because there was nothing left to clarify. After that, the messages shifted, fewer, but sharper, guilt disguised as concern, reminders of everything I owed them, warnings about consequences that no longer scared me. I didn't respond. One by one, I muted numbers, then blocked them, not dramatically or impulsively, but methodically, the way you lock a door you don't plan to open again. Cutting contact wasn't an emotional outburst, it was a decision followed through consistently. There was no final speech and no demand to be understood, just a boundary enforced without negotiation. The quiet that followed felt different from before, not empty, but stable as silence that made room for routines that belonged to me and relationships that didn't require me to shrink or compensate. I stopped being the oldest daughter whose job was to carry what others dropped, and became someone whose presence was optional, not expected. The story didn't end with reconciliation or mutual understanding, it ended with clarity. I chose a life where my worth wasn't measured by how much I could endure, and once that choice was made, there was no reason to keep the door open. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to leave a comment, sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.